Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. So much has gone down economically for India in the last few quarters. The most recent GDP numbers were a disappointment, but within that, some numbers did honestly stand out. What happened on the formal sector and its corporate earnings, for example, what has happened with exports so far, and the fact that FDI flows, which is flows coming in from foreign direct investment, do remain quite buoyant. On the other hand, there is clear evidence that the informal sector or the smaller businesses are really struggling. It is borne out by the fact that unemployment numbers have gotten worse over the last few months. And of course, it's also borne out by the fact that increasingly India's middle class is now shrinking and moving into a larger lower income bracket. How does one make sense of it? What are the most urgent issues that the government and indeed state governments should address? And how does one read the prospects for India's economy ahead? Joining me to talk about all of that is a very special guest indeed. I'm joined by Ananth Narayan, who's Professor of Finance at the SP Jain Institute of Management and Research. Anand, thank you so much for joining in. I really look forward to our conversations because I feel like we can meander into so many sort of subjects, but still perhaps end up at where we intended to. Let me start first with the most recent GDP numbers. Because there was not bipolarity, but certainly a very wide variance of reactions. Where at one point people did make the point that it's far lower than the year before, and it's far lower than many quarters before. But I think that the stated point of view from the government was that there's a lot more nuance to this growth, and don't take it just by the quarter. It looks great. What did you make of it?
Let's start with the actual numbers. So if you look at the April to June 2021 GDP as came out recently, and you compare it with April to June of 2019, which is 2 years ago, pre-COVID, and therefore unadulterated in a sense. The absolute value of the GDP in real terms is still about 9% lower than it was 2 years ago, right? So yes, we are on a path to recovery, but in reality, we are still lower in absolute terms, in real terms, than we were 2 years ago. But I agree that there are nuances, Mitali. The headline kind of masks a lot of ups and downs, and we discussed this in the past as well. The reality is that the formal sector is doing splendidly well. It's doing remarkably well. We've also, alongside the GDP numbers, had pretty much all of the June results which have come out, right? So if you look at, I think Economic Times tracks about 4,000 odd companies. If you look at the results for this particular quarter, again, April to June quarter, sales are up by about 7.5%. Profits are up by about close to 16% for these 4,000 odd companies. CMI likewise tracks for about 3,000 odd companies. The GVA for them is up by 18%. And people, I don't know if people realize this or not. If you look at the Nifty 50 stocks and you look at the earnings growth of Nifty 50, the joke that used to be there amongst analyst circles is, we would start the year by saying 20% earnings growth, and then we would hope that everybody had a poor memory when it came down to 3 or 4% by the end of the year. If I look at the August end numbers for Nifty 50 earnings, they're actually registering 27% earnings growth over a 2-year period. Okay, so August 2019 to August 21, it's a remarkable 27% year-on-year CAGR growth. I haven't seen this kind of growth since 2005. So it's actually a fantastic performance by the formal sector. And of course, within the formal sector, there are specific sectors that are not doing well, hospitality, or you can argue airlines, you can argue power and so on and so forth. But overall, across all of these companies, they're doing remarkably well. That just tells you, Mitali, that despite the formal sector doing so well and GVA actually expanding for them, if the overall GDP and GVA is still lower than it was 2 years ago in real terms, it tells you what the status is amongst the less formal sector, amongst the informal sector.
Correct.
And unfortunately, informal sector employs about 83-84% of the population, whereas the formal sector only employs about 16-17%. So it is definitely a nuanced story. And who was that who said this? I think Joan Robinson says this about India, right? Whatever you say about India, the opposite is also equally true. It is very stark in the current context, with a remarkably good story around the formal sector and an equally distressing story around the informal sector.
Yeah. What do you do with that, Ananth? I was reading also with interest the point that you made about the fact that there is this slim pie right at the top, which is still spending, still consuming, as you said, for the formal sector numbers are still good. Is that enough to resurrect an economy and to do it legitimately, for a long enough period of time? And, are there experiences from history on how an economy sort of progresses when you have this deep K that is underway? Because even the K has been debated by the government, but I think it's quite clear that's the shape and form we're taking.
Yeah, sure. Let's try and take this in pieces, Mitali. So first off, I think that tailwinds are in India's favor for the time being. So look at what's happening around China and Evergrande, and the questions about what could be the global spillovers of what's happening there. Likewise, there is geopolitics where China, a lot of global companies want to go into a China plus one strategy, and India actually fits in nicely in that perspective. Now, why am I mentioning this? If you actually look at India's formal sector, which is, by the way, represented in the equity markets, if you look at the fact that India is now trying hard to get in manufacturing and foreign direct investments, FDI, there is a production-linked incentives, there are tax breaks. Now, Prime Minister Modi will be in the US this week. He'll probably lay out the red carpet for more investments. So in reality, the tailwinds are in our favor. And given the resilience of our formal sector, we could see inflows coming in, we could see investments growing, and we could see things like the PLI actually work out in areas like automobiles and chemicals and in pharma and in textiles and so on and so forth. So actually this could do well. Now, what we would then hope for is this will trickle down into the rest of the economy, right? So you get the investments at the top, and hopefully that leads to more demand and more consumption, and therefore more jobs get created all the way down. The problem, though, is that would be a huge leap of faith, Mitali, because the two universes seem to be pretty parallel at this point in time. And I'm going to go into a bit of the weeds right now in terms of describing the nature of the problem for the informal sector.
Okay.
So let's go with a few high-level data. So there is this ILO, the International Labour Organization, that actually calculates the worker population ratio for different countries, including for India. Okay, so until about 2005, the worker to population ratio for India was about 55%. Okay, which means for the entire population, 55% is your workers, right? That's progressively come down to about 47% in 2019 and 43% in 2020. So just 43% of our eligible of our population was actually working in 2020. The comparative numbers for other countries, if you take Brazil, if you take Vietnam, China, Bangladesh, you name it, Indonesia, it ranges between 55 to 75%. Okay, so it's not a 6-7 year problem. It's a 15-year problem where we've struggled to create jobs in any meaningful numbers. Now, let me give another nuance to that. I know CMIE data is often beaten up, but let's go with CMIE data to start with. The important numbers are total number of people employed in manufacturing and services. Let's keep aside agriculture because that's not really value add, right? Now, about 5 years ago in 2016, you had about 26 crore people as per CMIE, who were employed in manufacturing and services. That number has come down now to 24 crores. We've actually lost 2 crore jobs in manufacturing and services over the last 5 years as per CMIE data. Okay, that is terrible news. And we keep saying we need to add 1.2 crore jobs every year. Forget about adding jobs; you're actually subtracting jobs. And if you say it's because of the pandemic, it's not. Even before the pandemic, we were actually losing jobs across manufacturing and services as per CMIE. Now, to those who say CMIE is all bunkum because it's not right, the government periodic labor force survey data actually ties in with that. So as of 2019, they also said 26 crore jobs available in manufacturing and services put together, which exactly ties in with CMIE data. By the way, the PLFS data is extremely liberal. You know what it does? On a weekly basis, it asks the persons it surveys, have you worked for at least 1 hour in the past 1 week? Okay, and if you say, yes, I worked for 1 hour, you're counted as employed and all of that. With that, it says 26 crore people in manufacturing and services. It also says if you're a household helper who's not getting paid, I will still count you as employed. Despite all of that, you get this number, which is not good at all. So It is a deep problem, Mitali, our inability to create jobs and output. The best way we can hope for is like we did with Maruti Suzuki. You start with a big company, and then that creates an ecosystem of ancillary companies and MSMEs and so on and so forth, which then creates a very large employment pool, right? You need something like that to happen across several industries now: electronics, chemicals, fertilizers, plastics, textiles, and so on and so forth. But that's going to take a lot of hard work. Just 2 or 3 announcements aren't going to achieve that. And we could be living in these two parallel universes for a long time.
It's also a small business problem, right, Ananth? I mean, the core of this employment problem is the way the small businesses have been hemorrhaged. And I remember, debating this with a former CII president, and he said, as an industry chamber, we've raised it many times. But do you think enough has been done to sort of just sit up and take notice? Because, like you said, it's not about the pandemic. They started maybe around demonetization. It got worse after GST, and then COVID was just the last straw on the camel's back. Are we doing anything of significance for this small business?
Again, it's a great question, Mitali, and I would extend this to beyond demonetization and GST to saying it's a 15-year problem. This reduction in the worker population ratio has been going on for a long time. So it goes across political dispensations. But having said that, are we doing enough now? So arguably, we are ticking some boxes. So you could say, for instance, that there is a lot of focus on trying to improve the ease of investments. And the government could legitimately list out a few things, reducing corporate taxes, changing your labor laws. We can argue till the cows come home whether it's right or wrong, but at least it's pro-business. PLI definitely is pro-business in some ways. They are trying to, for instance, this taking back this Vodafone retrospective act, etc. In many ways, and the prime minister standing up and saying the government has no business being in business. All of this ticks the right boxes. But the point is, from policy intent to declarations to actual reality on the ground is obviously a huge path to traverse, right? And the reality also is that it's not New Delhi and the prime minister's office that can ensure ease of doing business in an industrial estate in Telangana. It's a whole ecosystem from the center to the state government to the local governments, etc. And we've discussed this before, Mitali. China did not become China because of Beijing. It was 50 provinces and 50 mayors vying with each other to get the investments in, who ensured that the businesses actually flourished in each of those respective provinces. So in that respect, there is a long way to traverse. What we need is hard data around what's the situation on the ground so that problems can be addressed. What we need is empowering of local people rather than everything being centralized at one prime minister's office or Niti Aayog. What we need is individual states, trying to borrow the leaf from each of the ASEAN countries, for instance, and figuring out how is it that they manage to bring in investments into their respective countries, and then vying with each other as states to try and get those investments in. Can it be done? It can be done. Are we making some progress? Yes, some progress has been made. I listed out some of that. But I still think we have a long way to go before that actual trickle down actually works out. I'm going to add one more aspect to this. One thing I'm sure you hear from your CII friends and for that matter from global investors is India has also this paradoxical situation of having a very underemployed workforce and still not enough skilled workforce available, right? Which is bizarre. I mean, there are plenty of people available, especially women, available to work, but skilling them takes a long time. Now, again, you had lots of jazzy slogans around programs, Skill India, and so on and so forth, trying to address that. But at the core fundamental level, it needs a far more deeper investment into education, into healthcare, into nutrition, into actual public services to build up an ecosystem that throws out employable children. Eventually people who grow up to do things, become entrepreneurs, and to actually work well. Again, that investment is going to be a long-term 10-year prospect. A lot of work needs to happen on that front as well.
Let me ask you this another way, Ananth. I read an interesting tweet by Dr. Kaushik Basu saying that many politicians and governments choose actively not to do something very seriously about unemployment because it increases the troll base, using his words, for them. However, it has very serious consequences for the economy and for the prospects of these young people. Given what you're lining out, I'm going back to the point about what, whether we have precedents, in history, where you have this situation where there's one pocket that is doing incredibly well. I mean, even your point about FDI is well taken. It's, one of the best numbers we've seen in the past couple of years. What does that kind of economy look like?
Yeah, it's an unhealthy economy. I'm not sure it's a sustainable economy. Let's keep the moral aspects out of the picture. Let's do this purely as a hard-nosed economist or as a hard-nosed academic. You could argue that this is not sustainable. If you have large inequity, you would be vulnerable to social issues. You would be vulnerable to political tribulations, and you would be vulnerable to completely underperforming your potential. Imagine if you had a larger middle class of 30-40% of the population as opposed to a sliver of 15 crore people. Imagine what would happen to our GDP. I'm no political expert at all, Mitali. Kaushik Basu is in a different league altogether, and he's above my pay grade. But I'm going to venture and say that I can't imagine that any political party would actually want to do badly on economics. Delivering jobs would be any politician's dream. That's one great way of ensuring that you've got a base with you. But unfortunately, what seems to be happening in India at the moment is maybe economics is not the primary driver for politics. You would argue that if there was large inequity of this kind, there should be a political price to pay for, whether it's a state government or whether it's a central government. Right. But maybe in India, socio-political issues matter more than economic issues do. It seems to have been observed in the past as well, in the last 20 years, 25 years. Maybe that trend continues. So I would love to see political parties, for instance, I can't imagine any political party saying that we should not be doubling our health expenditure. It's less than 1% of our GDP, the government expenditure on health. Let's at least make it 2% of GDP. I can't see any political party opposing that. Yet I can't see any political party actually espousing that as a huge plank. Likewise with education, 3.5% is what we spend. China spends 4.5%, 5%. Most countries spend about 5%. Can we increase it to 5%? I think we should. It's a no-brainer. Yet I can't see any political party saying, this is going to be a major plank for going forward. I've gone completely out of the syllabus, Mitali, like you said.
Which is great, which is the point of a conversation. I wanted to get to some of the sort of the larger headline and highlight moments for an economy. One, whether you think the good work, that has been shown up in the GDP numbers makes a big impact on the fiscal numbers that we look at a couple of quarters down the line. And the other, whether you had a chance to read that very interesting Nomura report that sort of raised a lot of red flags about emerging markets, especially bringing the role of the central bank in. And I know that, you have a very strong understanding and relationship with the central bank. So you know how things have been ticking over the last few years. Do you think any of these headline moments for us could change? We have a better picture fiscally, we're better off than other emerging markets? Or do you think at this point we're equal risk with the rest of the gang?
Okay, I haven't read the Nomura report.
Oh, sorry, let me send it to you. It's a great report.
I will buzz Sonal and ask her for the report. But let's start with the fiscal side. Absolutely, I think the formalization of the Indian economy is definitely starting to help us from a fiscal perspective. So we've seen, for instance, fiscal deficit numbers, progressively head lower than they were at this time of the year compared to the last several years. In fact, if I remember the numbers, I think the total gross tax collections at the central level are about 29% higher than they were 2 years ago. This is despite the fact that the GDP is actually on the lower side. Your tax collections have actually shown a huge amount of buoyancy. So, in fact, very roughly, it looks like the central government could end up with about 2 to 2.5 lakh crores more revenue than actually budgeted in February. So that's great news as far as the headline numbers are concerned, and clearly eases a lot of the concern. We still have a very large 90% debt to GDP issue to worry about, and we don't know fully the consequences of that. But there is definite good news coming from formalization in terms of more tax coming in, collections coming in. But I want to leave a couple of caveats as far as the fiscal picture is concerned. One is a lot of that bonanza is actually going to the center.
Yeah.
In fact, states are receiving less from the devolution of that gross tax than they did 2 years ago. So if I remember the numbers, I think 2 years ago, the states till about July had about 2.1 lakh crores or so. This year, I think it's about 1.6 lakh crores or so. It's actually 40,000 crores or so lower. Okay. While the Finance Commission says you should be paying 41% of your gross tax to the states, in effect, they're only paying about 25%. And the reason for that is a lot of that gross tax collections is coming in the form of cess and surcharges, which are not shareable with the states. So while the center is celebrating, it's a pretty poor picture at the state level. And by the way, states account for 60% of the total expenditure of the government. Center is only 40%. So at the state level, there's a lot of pain. The second level of pain, which is still not been acknowledged, is there is still off-balance sheet pressure on government finances. The last year, they did a very good job of absorbing all the hidden stuff in Food Corporation of India. Yeah. They absolutely, which is the reason why the fiscal deficit kind of blew up, right? There is still stuff left, both at the central level and at the state level. State governments are notorious for not paying salaries in the last couple of months, just so that they can show a better fiscal deficit for this year. The white paper that came out from Tamil Nadu, that tells you there is a lot of mess in discoms. There's a lot of mess in state transport utilities. At a central level, now I know Mr. Nitin Gadkari will beat me up for saying this, but NHAI has not ratcheted up a lot of debt, over 3 lakh crores of debt. I know it's built a lot of infrastructure, but it does look like somewhere we'll have to bite the fiscal bullet and take some of this NHAI debt onto the books of the central government. So overall, while there's great news on tax collection, thanks to formalization, I think it's too early to say that we're out of the woods on the debt side. There's a lot of hidden stuff left, and the states are in deep trouble. Now, the second part of your question, are we therefore in a vulnerable position? I think not, Mitali. I think we are in a better place than many other emerging markets. And the reason for that is our enormous buffers that we've built up on the external front. Look, our reserves currently are at $640 billion plus. This, of course, includes some SDRs of the IMF, etc. If I add the forward purchases of RBI's dollars, it's over $690 billion. So normally when you have a taper tantrum or you have an emerging market blowout, the first area where there would be pressure is the currency. This time around, we have enormous degrees of freedom, policy freedom, thanks to our currency reserves. It's come for the wrong reasons. It's come because our consumption collapsed and therefore our imports collapsed. But nevertheless, we have that. Now, it doesn't buy us infinite time. It buys us time for 2 or 3 or 4 years, within which we have to get our act together of growing our jobs, growing our output, and growing our sustainable growth. So if we can get all of that done, I think we'll be fine. Like I said right at the beginning, given the strength of our formal sector, given the fact that we are switching towards reform, at least in intent, given the fact that we have this foreign currency reserves, I think we have I think we have external tailwinds in our favor right now. Even if the emerging market was to see a bit of a crisis because of this Evergrande and China and all of that, I think India would still relatively stand to benefit, particularly in a China plus one kind of mood that prevails in the world right now.
So if I had to stack them up on either sides, unemployment on the one side, what's happening with a shrinking middle class population and a growing lower income population on the one side, strong export numbers, FDI reserves on this side, strong formal economy, GVA on this side. When you're looking at the pluses and minuses, how are you feeling like the glass is half full or half empty? And which one do you think is the standout piece to look at within this?
There isn't an answer to this, Mitali. Both parts exist. You do have a standout positive part, which is the formal sector, which is the fact that investments will do well, which is that the goodwill towards India globally, I think, is pretty high at this point in time. Savings from the beneficiaries of the formal system, people are sitting on money. I like to say this, that money supply M1 which is currency in circulation, current account, savings account, has grown by close to 15.5% over the last 2 years, year on year. Okay, which means people are sitting on money. And that money is going to chase assets, whether it's stock markets, whether it's gold, whether it's Bitcoin. So you will see investments, you will see good news, you will see unicorns, you will see all of those bright, neon lights flashing and saying everything is fine. At the same time, you also have a big chunk of India which is suffering. And both parts are equally true. Now, I hate to use a silly analogy, but if you're like me who doesn't know how to cook, and you put a packet of milk inside the freezer, and you come out with an ice, which is frozen milk, and then you try to boil it on a stove, you'll find some parts of it boiling and some parts of it still frozen solid. An Indian economy is something like that. You will, for the people who want to see good news, you will see parts of it which are looking great. For those who want to dwell on the bad news, you will find plenty to see in the informal sector, in vast areas of employment, in the rural sectors, in urban poor as well, where there is real bad news. How do I take this all together? I think India can do far better. The problem is if we are concentrating on this 15-20% of the top, which is doing very, very well, of course, we will do well. We'll have a lot of happy market participants. We'll have a lot of happy industrialists. But we're completely underperforming our potential in terms of the rest of the population. Now, I'm hoping that the first can drag up the second, but it's not a given. It requires a lot of hard work for that actual dragging up to happen, for that trickle down to happen. It can't be taken as a given.
Let me ask you a final and third vertical question then, Ananth, because this one it's kind of my pet peeve. The problem is that nobody wants to open their hands up and invest or spend. If you look at the government spending numbers, it is capex declined by close to 40% in July this year compared to July the previous year. If you look at what private investment does, of course, it's an even worse picture. It's usually accounts for a third of GDP. And what was it, 17% lower in the April to June quarter, and they have not spent a penny ever since the corporate tax cut rate. So it's fine and jolly that the profit numbers are looking good, but there's zero investment. What do you do in that environment when everyone's hands and wallets are so tightly closed, and these are the guys that can really put some momentum into the process?
It's a great question. So look, first off, going at least by the headline budget numbers, the government does intend to increase capex, if I remember correctly, by about 35% over last year, right? I think it's 5.5 lakh crores this year compared to 4 point something the last year. The overall spending has
pipelines and schemes, yes.
Yeah, you're right. So the seeing is believing, and we'll have to see the NIP actually work out, etc. You're absolutely right on the private side, though. Private sector, barring a few exceptions here and there, and they're very few and far in between, isn't really thinking about investing at this point in time. If your capacity utilization is below 70%, why on earth would you think of investing? If you're managing to make decent, bottom lines simply by cutting down on costs, why on earth would you look at investing more? And if your top line is not looking great. So here is what I think will happen. Some amount of investments will come through, both from the government, because having made so much of fanfare about 110 lakh crores that they intend to spend, etc., I think some spending will definitely come through. It'll probably be a lot less than what they make it out to be, but something will come through. On the private sector side, because of things like PLI, the production-linked incentives, and because of this China Plus One, over time, I do see FDI sustaining, and therefore some amount of investments coming through there as well. So I do see an uptick. Now, will that be enough to therefore solve all our problems? No, I think a lot more needs to be done before we get there. So you're absolutely right in saying that we're not ambitious enough in our policy making in terms of addressing these issues. To me, the way to actually go full-fledged and full throttle into reviving the investment, economists like to say that the output is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. If you know that formula, you're an economist. So given that consumption is pretty meager at this point in time, clearly you need government spending, investments, and net exports to do well. Net exports is doing well, because of commodity prices going up, etc. But you need investments and government spending to go well. How can you get that done? You have to be a lot more ambitious. the points we made, spend a lot more into investing into education infrastructure, into healthcare, into nutrition, into public services, you will find a lot of support, even from fiscal hawks like me. If you blow up the fisc and put money into these areas, no problem, because these are investments for the future, long-term investments for the next 10 years. Second, I do hope and pray this NIP, which is a nice grand plan, actually works out, the infrastructure pipeline. Rather than controlling it from the Prime Minister's office, I wish they would let loose the states, the provinces, and decentralize the whole process, allow individuals to run with this, and therefore do a lot more of kickstart. Combination of government spending for healthcare infrastructure, education, and the NIP can hopefully kickstart animal spirits. Along with the PLI, you could see investments on the private sector as well. And then that hopefully builds up the MSME ecosystem. And then over the next 3, 4, 5 years, it'll take time. It won't happen overnight. But over the next 3, 4, 5 years, you do hopefully start to see manufacturing and service jobs being created. I would push the throttle a lot more on the implementation of the NIP and on spending on healthcare, education, etc. I think we are doing not enough on that score. But yes, will we see some progress? I think we will see some progress.
So I have a last question then. There's a feeling, Ananth, that we're kind of where we were pre the 90s in terms of what individual households are feeling. And I'm not talking about the top 2 or 3% that has generally actually had more to consume and more to spend, but just the way jobs have been impacted, the way, as you said, education has been impacted, health has been a huge spend, and they are not being able to save anymore. How do you think individual households are feeling at this point? And what would you liken it to in terms of a phase that India has lived through on a very personal level?
Sure. The best way to address that question, Mitali, again, hard-nosed answer, would be to look at the data. Now, one big problem I have with the current dispensation is that we don't get a lot of the data, which could answer this question in a form which is less emotional. So the last consumer expenditure survey, for instance, for which the results were published, was done in 2011, 2012. It gave us a picture of how much households spend in the rural areas, in the urban areas, and so on and so forth, right? And across 10 different deciles, how much are people actually spending? You actually had a lot of data. Thereafter, there was a survey done for 2017, 2018, the results of which were never published, right? Now, there was a business standard report which actually leaked the supposed results of that, which was not denied by the government, which suggested that the expenditure actually came down in real terms compared to 2011, 2012, maybe because of the aftermath of GST and demonetization. I don't know, but that seemed to be the takeaway. If that is indeed true, and if the survey is actually correct, that kind of answers the question that you raised, which is how are households actually feeling on the ground? Barring people like you and me, the more average Indian, how is she or he feeling about expenditure? The data, now the government did not deny it. They said there was problems with the actual way in which the survey was conducted, and they had a point as well. The funny part, Mitali, was the total consumption, which the C part of the equation of output, which the survey kind of came out with, was far lower than the numbers which GDP suggested. So either the GDP numbers were wrong or the consumption numbers were wrong. And that's the reason why they kind of shelved that report. The next report is supposed to be done for 22-23. So we should get a next report, hopefully, in God's good time. But if the indications are to go by, it's not feeling good. And it goes to the broader point that we discussed. While there is this 15-16% of the top population which is doing very well, and that's going to keep India shining in many ways, there is a lot of data, whether it's employment data from the ILO, whether it's CMIE data, whether it's official periodic labor force survey data, or the consumer expenditure survey data, which is half available to us, suggesting there is a lot of pain in the background, right? So the median Indian is worse off and definitely below potential, which is the sad story for India as things stand. But there are tailwinds. Investments, I think, will pick up. FDI, PLI, I think are best bets for going forward. I wish we would push the throttle harder on some of these investments and on investments into healthcare, education, etc. But I think we will see a small uptick from here. I'm hoping that the government eventually presses down on the accelerator and therefore gets the growth going a lot faster. But yes, we have a kind of an indifferent story at this point in time if you want to look at an overall picture.
Neither half nor full, but always so engaging speaking with you, Ananth. Thank you for putting all those very many moving parts into perspective. It was great to hear your thoughts, and I really do hope the next few quarters bring more cheer for what's happening at the bottom of the pyramid rather than the top. Thank you again.
Amen to that, and thank you again.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.